Good afternoon, everyone. Sandra, Lourdes, and Melissa. It's a pleasure. My name is Eduardo Abadía. Is General Manager to the Spanish Franchise Association. And it's a pleasure for me to open this workshop about subject to important for the franchise system, especially with two of our member, Bird&Bird and GNF, two members. It's very important for us. I want to stress the importance of the new legislation for franchise in Europe. That has been approved the 10th of May of 2022, the new regulation for the franchise system in Europe. And for this is a very important moment to speak what is the relationship into Dubai and Spain and Europe, because the law is the similar in other countries in the Europe, and it's very important to know what is the situation in Dubai to learn to introduce your Spanish branch in Dubai and other side. Many congratulations for the initiative for Bird&Bird and Melissa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your opening words, and most of all, thank you for all of your support. We truly are honored to be a part of the AEF, la Asociación Española de Franquiciadores, and we thank you for all of your trajectory and everything that you do for the franchise sector here locally and also globally.
Okay. Thank you.
So hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Franchising in Spain and the UAE. Today, we're going to be focusing on the legal aspect of franchising in these territories. I am Sandra Carrillo. I am the CEO of GNF Worldwide, the leading global firm, experts in franchise development and internationalization. And I'm here with two amazing women, both partnered from Bird&Bird. I'm here with Melissa Murray from the UAE and with Lourdes Ayala from Spain. Ladies, please, can you introduce yourselves? Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. So I'm Melissa. I'm head of the Bird&Bird Middle East Intellectual Property Department. I specialize in franchising. In the United Arab Emirates, there are a lot of international brands that franchise into the region. Obviously, we have a very strong market in tourism, and so a lot of international brands have opened in Dubai for their marketing, but also we just have a great population, a very high expat population, and a very franchise-friendly and business-friendly environment.
Thank you, Eduardo, again for honoring us with your presence, and thank you, GNF, for organizing this together with us. My name is Lourdes Ayala. I head the corporate department here, and we have a focus on retail and consumer sector and in franchising. We are very glad to have Melissa with us here to give a short presentation on internationalization and on the legal perspective, basically on comparing. The idea is to compare the environment in Europe in general, as you said, Eduardo, and Emirates. So yeah, I hope it's very interesting for everyone, and let's start. Perfect. Okay, Lourdes, so let me start asking you a question. We have a lot of Spanish clients that want to grow locally, and we have many international brands that see Spain as their main destination for expansion. So from a legal perspective, how do you see the franchise sector in Spain? Okay, so first of all, as we were commenting, Spain is part of Europe. So part of the franchise the regulations applicable to the franchise system entering into Spain would be harmonized. So that is the first thing that we have to take into account. Second, in Spain, we have, we would say, in the middle of the regulation. I mean, we are not very highly regulated as maybe in Emirates that we've commented for, or the USA probably is more regulated. In Spain, we have specific regulation, very few specific regulation on the franchise system. And we do have some certainty on what to do and what not to do. And then there are other regulations that are not specific to franchise that we have to take into account. So basically, I would say it's quite similar to other European countries. And it's a good place, for example, we were talking about before, it's a good place to be established coming from Latin America, for example, because of the cultural environment. And also we can talk about later about the litigation aspect and, you know, the whether or not, I mean, our case law is already very familiarized with franchise. So pretty, I think we can say in short that we have a certain, we have a lot of certainty in when it comes to legal.
It's a good point of entry.
It's a good point of entry, we think, yeah.
Perfect. And Melissa, without a doubt, the UAE has become a very attractive territory and many brands want to land there.
Mm-hmm.
So from a legal perspective, how would you describe the franchise sector in the UAE?
So from a legal perspective, the UAE is very pro-franchising and it's not very highly regulated. So it's an easy market for a franchisor to come into. You have to understand that there are still these big families in the UAE who have a lot of brands. And so they are also very familiar with the franchise model and they help commercialization and it's a very well-known method of doing business. So a lot of all of the UK high street brands, European brands and American brands are already there. And they have been as franchises for the last 40, 50 years. The UAE does not have a specific franchise law. Saudi Arabia, so next door to the UAE, does now have a franchising law which requires disclosure. But for an international brand coming into the UAE, you don't need to do a franchise disclosure document. Your standard franchise document, which a brand would use in other territories, is what we use, but then we tailor it for UAE law. We do have some commercial agency laws and a commercial code and a civil code, which also do apply, but there are a lot of, it's very business friendly. There are a lot of things that we can do in the commercial contract, which is pro getting to a commercial contract. There's not a lot of laws that will come in and that franchisors need to be worried about.
That's good news.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, how regulated is the franchise sector in the UAE, you would say?
So it's not regulated in terms of that you need to do a franchise registration. There are certain laws, so similar to what you were saying, there are trademark laws, so you need to protect your brand. There are commercial code and civil code laws which can come in terms of if you're dealing with a company that's 100% Emirati owned, but we can contract out of a lot of those laws. So from a legal perspective, normally we would have, if it's a Spanish brand, Spanish governing law, or if it's a US brand, it might be American governing law, or if it's a British brand, English governing law, and we would have an arbitration clause that carves out a lot of local laws. I mean, obviously there are some local laws that will apply in terms of signage and employment and labour laws and landlord tenant laws in terms of leasing that impact the franchisee. But from a franchisor perspective, not a lot of the local laws will apply if you get a good lawyer to help you contract out of those things.
Exactly, that is the idea.
Yeah.
Really be accompanied by the best experts to make sure that the way is actually more easier
Yes.
than it looks. Because
Yes.
actually it's very simple, but you have to follow the right steps.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Lourdes, the same question. In your perspective, how regulated is the franchise industry here in Spain?
So I guess it's quite similar in relation to a franchise to the franchisor. It is different because there is a disclosure obligation, which is very important to follow, and a cool-off period of 20 days that is very important to follow because it can. It's easy to do. We normally get the US or the whatever template the client has already, right? and we use it and tailor it for Spain. It's not difficult, but if it's not followed, it's very risky because it would risk the validity of the agreement. So in that sense, I was saying it's kind of in the middle in terms of regulation. In another respect, I think our environment for the rest, of course, it does impact. So a franchise system, it does have to take into account a lot of regulations that are not specific to franchising, right? Like trademark, like Melissa was saying, labor, lease agreements. But in general, it's pretty. Our legal environment is very inclined towards business also, and very highly harmonized with Europe. And the new regulation that you were mentioning, Eduardo, before, on the new EU regulation on vertical restrictions has come to make it easier, if you want, or to regulate some things that were that created a little bit of uncertainty, like what a franchisor and a franchisee, what a franchisor can limit. How can it limit the online, for example, distribution by a franchisee, or the dual pricing, or other things that are, I think, are good to, it's a good news that we have it. So
I agree. I am a firm believer that really the franchise legal framework is there to help, actually, not to make things harder, as maybe some people would say, but it's actually there to protect both parties, the franchisor and the franchisee.
certainty.
So I do see a lot of benefits. So let me ask you about those benefits as well. What do you say those benefits are in the UAE?
Well, because in a way, in the UAE, because it's not so highly regulated from a franchise perspective, that does make it quite easy for brands to come into the market. I do also a lot of work in Saudi Arabia, and it's a very different system there because they do have a specific franchise law, and there is registration requirements, there is a cooling off period, there is a disclosure document, things have to be translated into Arabic. And if you're an international brand trying to go into, for example, Saudi Arabia, there is a lot of compliance and a lot of steps that you have to take before you can get to a deal, before you can take a deposit, before you know that your franchisee is serious about the brand. Whereas in the UAE, we don't have that. So I would say in the UAE, because we don't have strict franchise legislation, deals get done faster, which is good because Dubai is also very dynamic. A lot of new brands coming into places like Dubai Mall and a lot of the big shopping malls and the tourist destinations, because they're looking for the new hottest brands that are always coming in. So it's like I said before, very business friendly, which means that, but also the purpose, in my view, of franchise regulation is to protect franchisees who are investing a lot of money into a brand. And the dynamic in the Middle East generally, but also in the UAE, is that you have big families with a lot of money, and they have big teams of in-house lawyers and big teams of business development who can really assess a brand properly. So they don't need a franchise law to protect them. So I think it's good that we don't have a specific franchise regulation in the UAE, because it just helps deals flow faster.
Yeah, it's a completely different marketplace.
Yes.
When we talk about the UAE. And for Spain, for example, Lourdes, what would be the benefits you see in these regulations?
I think in the regulation, you mean, or I mean, I think we have to point out two things. One is, I agree, the franchise regulation is there to protect the franchisees. So at the end, I don't see it really as an impediment. It's true that it's a little bit slower, but I see it as a benefit to create certainty and to protect the market generally, because it's true that we have a different market here. There's a lot of franchisees that are quite small. There are others that are very professional, as we know, right, in the franchisee world. But it's true that differently from your market, the Emirates market. It's in Spain, we have a lot of small franchisees accessing the market, right? And so that is a protection that I think gives protection to the franchisor at the end, also, because it establishes a legal framework that is always good. You know, the certainty, I think, is good for both parties. So that's first. Second, as you know, the franchisor's registration that used to be a requirement, it has been suspended without, and in principle is not applicable right now, right? And the registration, I think, was a good idea. I think right now it's good that it's not there because it didn't give certainty enough. So what I think is that it's a benefit. So in general, the benefit, I think, of our case law, we have to take it also into account that it's a very established legal framework. And as the report that has been done by the association shows clearly, we don't have a lot of litigation. I think it's an environment where parties reach an agreement where they do know their rights and their obligations, and the litigation has and the judges know the system. They apply it consistently, pretty consistently, and I think it's a good legal environment in general.
I agree, because you get more confident to get into that system, into that environment, because it's regulated and you know already what to expect, what you must do, what as a franchisee, what are you going to get. So you know the rules before entering the sector. So I agree. It's something that can give you peace of mind sometimes.
Right.
It can make things slower sometimes, but I agree completely here. You have more single unit franchisees maybe as well entering the market. So they do need more protection than maybe in the UAE. So maybe it's more necessary right now. And what about the challenges, Lourdes? What challenges do you see in that regulation?
So I think there is one challenge that we constantly see, that we see in the case law, and that I would like to point out, which is the liability of the franchisor and the limits of the liability of the franchisor. So the franchisor, and that is particularly something that is not regulated, in fact, and that is why I think it has a lot of uncertainties. So something that, and what am I referring to? What are, if the franchisee incurs in liability, that could affect the franchisor. We've seen that in some case law, in some recent case law, and we see it as a challenge really for the franchisor, and we think it's something that should be better, in fact, should be better regulated to make certain what kind of controls the franchisor should establish on the franchisee, because establishing too much control could trigger liability, while not having sufficient control could make it riskier for the franchisor, because it may in fact impact, and it may, third parties could claim, and we've seen that case law upholding claims from consumers against the franchisor directly for something that has happened within the control of the franchisor, so of a franchisee. So I think that is the biggest challenge that we currently have in Spain. I don't know how that is in the UAE. That is certainly for me the biggest question mark.
I agree, because it goes against actually the whole nature of franchising, which is having two separate entities
independent
and independent control.
Yes.
And the franchisor not being able to operate his own business on a day-to-day basis trusts the franchisee to do its best and to follow the protocols. So I agree that there should be limitations on what can go back to the franchisor and what cannot. Right. It's actually something.
And how to avoid it.
Exactly. That goes around in other markets. For example, in the US, they're also working very hard on that as well, because there are some limitations and there are always challenges that appear. And in the UAE, Melissa, what are the challenges or the main challenges that you see?
I would say that most of the challenges and the issues that I see are more on the operations side. We are in the Middle East, and especially Dubai, because it is a hub for the whole region, and our shopping malls are open very late into the night, into the early morning. And so there are times when franchisors aren't used to the fact that they've got a franchisee who is open almost 24/7, and a franchisee will ring on a different time zone on a different weekend in the middle of the night requiring support. And I've had a few disgruntled franchisees when the franchisor doesn't, because we do a lot of American franchising in, and obviously we are open Saturdays, Sundays, and the franchisor's office may not be open on a franchise on that kind of weekend. And if the franchisee needs support, they need someone that they can call, and it might be their weekend in the States, and might be the middle of the night in the States. And so it's an operational challenge. Trademarks are also a bit of a challenge, because the UAE is, and all of the GCC are what we call first to file countries. So quite often it is a tactic that some franchisees use, or even trademark squatters, that they will hold other brands' trademarks. And it's extremely difficult to get that trademark back if your franchisee has registered or a third party has. So we have had instances where brands have come and they've either had to tailor or rebrand or slightly change their mark because someone else has it. Also, the language of the country is Arabic, and sometimes a brand might not translate into Arabic very well. So there are language difficulties. Arabic and English, it's not a direct translation, it's an interpretation. So some brands, when they translate into Arabic, make no sense. Yeah. Or they come across really funny, which is not what you want. You want to be a serious brand. You don't want to be a joke. So, you know, we have a team of Arabic speaking lawyers and associates who will check these sort of things. And then there's cultural considerations. You know, pork is not allowed. There are certain religious symbols that are not allowed. So it's more on the operations side, but this is where finding a good partner, a good franchisee. I always say to my franchisor clients that, you know, the due diligence on the franchisee, and you're going into a marriage, basically. It's a long-term contract. This is not a 2-year deal. Some of the deals are 20 years and they're renewing every 10, 20 years. So, and the idea, and especially in the UAE, these franchisees, they want a 20-year business plan, because for the franchisees, it costs a lot of money for them. You know, they might not be making any profit for a while. It might be a year, it might be 2 years. Some of the very successful brands, especially some of the big burger brands that have come in, have made profit very quickly. But, you know, quite often these franchisees also, they want that long-term contract because they are spending a lot of money up front. So getting a good franchisee that can help the franchisor deal on the operations side and tailor things as necessary for the market, it's very important.
I agree completely. Our founding partner says actually that franchising is like a marriage, but without the romance.
Yes.
I don't know if I have some questions from the audience or from the Zoom participants.
No.
Okay.
It's pretty clear.
Okay, very clear.
Answered all the questions.
So I don't know, Lourdes, if you want to give us your final recommendations or your final advice.
Yeah, I think what Melissa just said is quite important. I mean, I think making the due diligence about the franchisee is quite important. Also, if you want to go international, whether it is to Spain or anywhere else in the world, I think there are some things that you need to take into account. I think you need to, from a legal perspective, I'm talking, of course, not from a commercial perspective. There are things that you need to think about whenever you start a franchise network. You want to think about the template, and you want to think about that out from the start, I think. I mean, the contract is quite important. Changing later, it's a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
So, you know, from the beginning, if you want to start a franchise network, which generally speaking, it tends to be the beginning of an internationalization, or that's the purpose of the franchise, to grow, and if possible to grow international. You want to think about the templates. You want to think about applicable law, which is quite important in arbitration, and you want to have that as standard, as complete, as good in all senses, which does not mean complex necessarily, but complete from the beginning. So that is something that I would urge everyone to think about whenever, from the very beginning. And second, I think trademark protection that Melissa just mentioned. And, you know, we have the benefit, of course, of being in Europe. Protection at the level of at the European level is very simple, because it's, you know, it's a little bit more expensive than protecting at national level, but definitely it's worth. And of course, thinking about the business plan and where you want to expand is it's critical, because we've had clients that had protection in some countries, but maybe forgot to check one critical country for them, which was in the business plan already from the beginning, if you want, or in the, I don't know, in the strategic plan, I would say, and then changing it later, it's not what you want, right? You want a very strong trademark. So I think those are the recommendations that I would give.
Thank you, Lourdes. And Melissa, what would you recommend?
So at the moment, the UAE is still very much inbound, international businesses coming inbound. So we do also take the template of the brand, because the idea with franchising is that it is a set model across the brand. Everyone is the same. And I also want to make sure that the franchisees in the Middle East are on the same payment schedule. You know, you don't want the franchisor's finance team having different franchisees paying at different dates. You don't want the commercial contract to be very different. We do, however, obviously tailor it for local UAE law, and we do focus quite heavily on dispute resolution and governing law. But also, because in the UAE we have a lot of sophisticated area developers and master franchisees, so they do negotiate the contract quite heavily. But because usually there is a very large development schedule, it's very rare to do the single unit franchising. It's area developers who are usually going to be opening at least 5, maybe 20, maybe 50. It depends what kind of brand it is. So the contracts are negotiated quite heavily, but at the same time, we negotiate the area development agreement, fine, but we try and keep the actual operational franchise agreement, or the operating agreement, as standard to the system as much as possible, because we don't want the franchisor having to deal with different contracts across the network. I would say get a good lawyer at the beginning. Obviously, I've seen some horror stories of people who get a bit too excited by opening in Dubai, and then things go horribly wrong 3 or 4 years later, or the franchisor is upset that the franchisee hasn't met the development schedule, but maybe it was an unrealistic development schedule at the beginning. I've seen some ridiculous development schedules that were never ever going to be met. So I think also investigating the market properly and really having a good think about whether your brand is appropriate. Will it do well? It is a competitive market, because there are a lot of big brands already in the UAE. And in that case, I would encourage Saudi, because Saudi is almost a greenfield site. They're really encouraging, the government there are really encouraging the brands to come in as part of their quality of life program that they've got going on at the moment. Obviously, trademark searches and then protection, but just getting good quality counsel and really investigating and doing proper due diligence.
Thank you. Thank you. If I have a piece of advice, if I may, I would say surround yourself with experts from the beginning. It's a very good investment, actually. Sometimes you would think it's a cost. No, it's a good investment that will prevent you from having a much higher cost in the future. Also, to understand that you need tailor-made solutions for you. It's not good enough when some people come to us and they tell us, oh, we got the agreement from this global brand and we just erased the name and we put our name on it.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. It's like putting on some clothes that don't belong to you. It may look okay in the beginning, but it's not going to work in the end. And actually also remember that the franchise system is a system and the legal framework is a very important part of it, but it also has to be very geared with the other franchise elements, which is the strategic planning, the economic model, the operational manuals, and the development plan, as you have both mentioned. So remember, it's a system. All of its variables need to be very geared and very complete in order for you to have the right protection. I don't know, Eduardo, do you want to give some advice, something?
No, it's very interesting your conversation, because each country is different around the world. I think I say anything is no, because when I visit the first time in the Dubai 2 years ago, for me it was in a wonderful market, but very limited to the shopping center, because the more important, for example, now in Spain, the brands are returned to the shopping center, other change. But in the Dubai, for the temperature, for the customs, it's possible to the more important, a big, very expensive, very expensive world is shopping center. That's very incredible.
Yeah.
I'm very concentrate to in my experience, the Spanish brand are very concentrated for the not two, but at least very special business group. No? Very concentrate for in this case. Is a little question for you is. The master franchise is the most usual to the phone to introduce your Spanish brand in the Dubai in the States. Is the normal to
so it's either it's usually the area development model. With my legal hat on, we don't like master franchising that allows sub-franchising because we don't have a franchise law. So because there's no. It depends on how the contract is structured, but I've had some horror cases where sub-franchising in the system might have been allowed, but the master or area has disappeared, and then the brand are trying to create a legal nexus to the sub-franchisee, or the sub-franchisee is very upset and they want franchise or support and it's not there because it was meant to be with the master. So with the legal hat on, because we don't have a franchise law, we don't encourage sub-franchising. It's very much the area developer model. There will be one group, a company, individual single unit deals are just usually not done. Or exactly. Yeah. So even the very few single unit deals are always still contemplating a minimum of 3 or 4. They might start with 1, but they have a right of first refusal for unit 2, 3, 4 coming. It's also very common that the UAE isn't the only country given. So it might be an area development agreement with all of the 6 GCC countries, the Gulf countries. So Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi, and the UAE all put together with a development schedule per country. Because again, there are big families that are across the whole GCC and they will open multiple outlets and they have teams that do this. So yeah, they're very sophisticated franchisees.
Yes, it's a quite different environment.
Yeah.
Yes. Very challenging, but lots of opportunities as well.
Well, that's the thing. So I've been in the UAE 16 years now. And when I first, because I did franchising in Australia as well, which is again, a very different market, again, very highly regulated in terms of franchising. And it was all international brands coming in. And I would say in the last 6-7 years, is where we've seen some local brands beginning to franchise and where single units are beginning to pop up. So some domestic franchising is starting, but it's still a small percentage of the overall retail and consumer market. It's
Yes.
still very heavily international brands coming in.
I agree. We as a company receive lots of global brands wanting to enter the UAE, but now we're receiving, yes, brands from the UAE wanting to convert themselves into franchise systems
Yeah.
and start a local expansion.
Yeah.
So we're going to see a lot of movement and evolution in the next few years. And we are very glad to be a part of it.
Good.
Right? Sure. Okay, so I want to thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Eduardo,
you.
for
It's a pleasure.
everything. And thank everyone that has been here. I hope this webinar was useful, that we all learned something. I'm sure we did. And I hope you join us for our next webinars. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thank to everyone that is meeting us through Zoom as well.
Thank you.
Silence, please.
Perfecto. Felicidades, estuvo muy bueno. Very, very nice, really.
I like it a lot because it was very dynamic. So it's very nice.